The vent beneath my boots hissed with a barely audible acid burn. I dropped like a bead of black rain into the maximum security isolation cell, a metal box reeking of antiseptic and raw despair. The 3 guards didn't even have time to spin up their cognitive shields before I severed their neural synapses. The last guy, making a desperate dive for the manual alarm, got his cervical spine snapped under my heel. Id slagged the alarm half an hour ago, but instinct is a bitch. Fear always makes meatbags do useless things. This was the daily grind, diving into brains that thought their willpower was titanium, only to shred their deepest secrets into confetti. By the time the client's final payment pinged my account, the most vicious syndicate boss on this rock was reduced to a drooling husk staring at a corner. I was just about to hail my stealth shuttle for extraction when a new, maximum priority contract flashed across my neural interface. Triple the standard payout, 0 operational restrictions. But when I ran my routine scan over the target's dossier, the most critical data field made my core temperature plummet. In the Psionic Hackers Guild, only one ironclad law outranks the payout. Yet right here, on this premium contract, the target species field was completely blank. My thumb crushed down on the interface's haptic pad, incinerating every byte of that blank contract's data stream until not even a ghost of a backlog remained. Backhanding the heavy metal cable jacked into my upper spine, I yanked hard. The 4-inch probe ripped out, slick with the mob boss coagulating cerebrospinal fluid. The viscous, transparent sludge hit the alloy deck, etching 3 tiny smoking craters into the plating. I pinched the comms module, physically crushing the preloaded shuttle hailing code. A triple payout blank ticket. If the guild had the balls to issue it, I had the balls to take it, but I wasn't leaving them a single docking coordinate to track me. I shimmied back into the acid-eaten vent, scaling the shaft toward the roof on all 4s. The stench of scorched machine oil baking on the vent walls mixed with the raw, wet ozone pouring in from the storm outside, making the 3 pairs of sensory fins on the back of my neck twitch with anxiety. The bulletproof permaglass of the roof exhaust port didn't stand a chance against a fully charged kinetic kick. Shards rained down in a torrent of freezing water as I vaulted through, landing dead center on the saddle of my stealth hover bike idling in the shadows. The anti-grav engine purred into a low, predatory growl, atomizing the rain in a 2-foot radius into fine mist. I cranked the throttle to the max. The chassis banked hard, shaving the paint off a low-altitude patrol mech sensory dome as we blasted past, the tires ripping through standing water to kick up a waist-high wake. The neon holo billboards were just a smeared blur in the downpour, bleeding jagged ribbons of color across the flooded streets. I hardwired my neural jack straight into the bike's mainframe. The engine's raw roar slammed through the cable directly into my cortex. Every interceptor, every blockade, I threaded the needle right along the grav walls, not even scratching a micron of my armor. In under 7 minutes, I'd shaken off every tracking ping and plunged headlong into the outer quarantine zone of the interstellar black market. The bike's stealth canopy auto-disengaged as the engine cut out by a sewer entry shaft. Gripping my neural synapse-severing blade, I dropped into ankle-deep sludge. A suffocating cocktail of rotting organic paste, spent crankcase oil, and nameless chemical solvents instantly enveloped me. My combat boots crushed a bloated block of synthetic refuse, letting the pitch-black water seep right over my boot collars. Exposed to the dank air, the microcilia on my 3 pairs of neck fins puffed up in an agitated shiver. Unslinging the heavy brainwave scanner from my shoulder, I slammed it onto an abandoned, rust-bolted pipe housing. I snapped the 4 locking latches dead with a loud clack and cranked the power valve. A pale blue standby light flickered to life, catching the oily sheen on the toxic water at my feet. I yanked the signal feed line and jammed the probe flat against the underside of the rusted grate overhead. My fingers flew across the tuning dials, aggressively filtering out the junk frequencies, the erratic spikes of some junkie tweaking in the alley, the sluggish alpha waves of a checkpoint guard slacking on shift, the adrenaline spikes of hover cabbies punching their throttles. The dial clicked into the maximum fidelity notch. I angled my primary eyes through the grate slots, locking right onto a guy in a drab gray uniform power walking with a black dry bag clutched to his chest. Daniel. He sidestepped a speeding hoverbike, kicking up dirty rain, gripping that bag like a lifeline. His shoulders were wound tighter than a combat crossbow. He nearly bowled over a stack of glow fungus crates at a street vendor's stall, the alien merchant's muffled curses bleeding through 2 feet of reinforced concrete. The scanner's tri-point locator pins snapped into alignment with a mechanical clatter. The crimson tracking LED danced wildly along the edge of the readout panel. I mashed the scan button. The LCD screen instantly detonated in blinding critical red. The klaxon shook the pipe housing so hard that rust flakes showered into the muck. The waveform vomiting across the display was flatline smooth, like it had been rolled out by an industrial press. No partitioned logic, no compartmentalized cognitive ripples of an advanced species, just the monolithic single-threaded chaos wave of a human. The exact kind of red page guild anomaly guaranteed to melt a psionic hacker's core processor into slag. The ciliary muscles in all 3 of my eyes seized up at once. The microcilia on my neck fins spiked into rigid needles. Triple payout or not, no amount of credits was worth boiling my own gray matter into a cranial soup. My fingers blurred, popping the 4 latches and ripping the feed line off the grate. I slammed the scanner's blast-proof lid shut with a deafening bang. Backhanding the neural blade from where it rested by my boot, I snatched it up and started sliding backward through the slick, black sludge, refusing to risk even half a glance back up at the grate. I hadn't even bled off my rearward momentum when the sensory fins behind my right ear completely flared out. The high-pitched sizzle of a localized high-explosive fuse pierced right through the ambient hum of the sewer, stabbing straight into my auditory nerves. A muffled thump. Then 2 feet of load-bearing concrete crumbled inward like a stale biscuit. Corrosive black sludge and jagged chunks of rebar rained down as the choking stench of ozone, ammonium nitrate, and power armor coolant oil instantly flooded the narrow shaft. 3 heavy assault silhouettes coated in anti-ricochet primer stomped through the rubble breach. The point man had Kyle sloppily spray-painted on the side of his helmet. No guild insignia, no Merc Company patches on their chest plates, and all 3 of their plasma rifle hardpoints were glowing, primed to fire. A chunk of concrete clipped my shoulder pauldron and splashed into the water, splattering pitch-black mud across half my visor. The terrifying whine of charging plasma filled the tunnel. 3 searing neon orange bolts swept right through the empty space. I did just vacated, punching clean holes through the rusted main lines behind me. Scalding condensation dumped right over my head. My knuckles turned bone white around the hilt of my severance blade. My boots slid another 2 feet back through the grease, plastering my spine dead flat against the oxidized wall. My peripheral caught an ancient, high-pressure waistline embedded in the left bulkhead. The analog needle on its gauge was twitching violently in the red zone. The steam blast from that thing would eat right through military-grade armor gaskets. I brought the blade up. The high-frequency oscillating edge bit perfectly into the pipe's weakest weld seam, and I violently wrenched my wrist. Boom! The 2-foot-thick high-pressure main ruptured outward. A geyser of toxic sulfide and waste acid blasted into the open tunnel. Hitting the cold air, it instantly flashed into a blinding, milky white steam cloud, flooding the chamber and washing out the 3 Mercs thermal optics into pure white noise. Blind plasma fire crisscrossed the fog, cooking the air with a deafening crackle. Stray sparks hit the water, igniting pools of chemicals into dancing, toxic blue-green flames. I coiled my core tight and launched into a low, ground-skimming slide right through the thickest blind spot of the vapor, my boots kicking up sprays of toxic filth. The nearest merc, completely blind on thermals, was still hip-firing his plasma rifle into the wall where I used to be. Searing orange bolts punched through the rusted plating, the radiant heat crisping the synthetic fibers on the back of my suit. I pivoted my wrist, sending a lethal hum through the high-frequency blade, and slotted the edge perfectly into the 2mm seam between his armored collar and his helmet seal. I put all my weight behind the thrust, and the grinding teeth chewed straight through his bioneural uplink cord. Every status light on his exoskeleton strobe flashed critical red. His servos locked up instantly. The half-raised rifle clattered uselessly into the muck, and all 400 pounds of heavy armor pitched forward like a lead ingot. He face-planted straight into a puddle of burning blue-green waste, splashing my back with acid-laced mud. I stomped my boot heel hard against the downed merc's cervical plating. The massive rig sank another half-foot into the sludge, spitting up corrosive droplets that frosted my visor with microburns. The high-frequency hum of my blade was still rattling my carpal bones. My free hand plunged into the boiling muck, hooking the stock of his still misfiring plasma rifle. Using the corpse for leverage, I snapped upright, whipping the spitting barrel dead to rights onto the second thermal blob staggering through the steam. I pinned the trigger. A blue-white plasma bolt slammed dead center into his visor. Half a centimeter of plasteel melted away like hot wax. Boiling alien blue blood and liquefied neural gel blasted out the back of the helmet, splattering against the rusted bulkhead to eat bubbling, fizzing craters into the iron. The rig didn't even sway. It just tipped backward like a felled tree, crashing into the water. A dying neural reflex kept his finger clamped on the trigger, sending half a mag of plasma straight up into the ceiling, turning a concrete slab into falling gravel. Chunks of masonry rained down into the black water around me, splashing foul rain up to my waist. I gripped the overheating plasma rifle, the fins on my right side stiffening into rigid spikes as I hard-locked onto the final thermal signature in the haze. The screech of a kinetic grapple firing tore through the gap in the ceiling, followed instantly by Daniel letting out half a choked scream. The winch motor roared, pulling with enough torque to snap a steel I-beam. A split second later, the human was violently dragged down into the sewer, his precious dry bag slapping into the muck. It was Kyle. His 400-pound power boots gouged deep trenches in the slick flooring as he lunged forward, grabbing Daniel by the collar. A barbed metallic gauntlet clamped shut around the human's throat, slamming him backward until his skull cracked against the corroded pipe wall. Daniel's windpipe let out a terrible, wheezing squeak. His face flushed violently purple as his boots kicked uselessly at the toxic water. I already had the plasma rifle's trigger half-pulled when my retinal display caught Kyle's, left hand dropping to his utility belt. He yanked out a micro-memory extraction needle, the polished silver glaring in the dim light. His suit's external speakers cracked with static, bleeding, heavy, ragged breaths. Take one step and I'll wipe this meatbag's gray matter clean right here. The threat was still hanging in the steam when he drove his wrist down, aiming the needle right at the soft base of Daniel's skull with a vicious, whistling arc. I flicked my wrist, launching the still vibrating neural blade straight from my grip. The humming metal parted the milky steam like a ghost. 0.17 seconds later, the blade bit perfectly into the 2mm gap in Kyle's right wrist gauntlet. The matte black steel instantly minced his servo motors and organic carpals into a paste. His entire severed hand, still death gripping the silver extraction needle, was pinned brutally into the rusted pipe wall, showering the dark with cherry-red sparks. But the kinetic force of the downward thrust hadn't fully bled off. The needle grazed Daniel's hairline, slicing a half-millimeter nick into his scalp. A single bead of warm crimson blood seeped through his dark hair, smearing against the cold, bright steel of the probe. A second later, Kyle's entire armored rig seized violently, convulsing like it had been hit with a 1,000,000-volt industrial mainline. Every external status light on his helmet went supernova white. The HUD glass cracked under its own pressure with a sharp snap. Nothing but ear-bleeding digital static shrieked from his speakers, a massive data overflow choking him before he could utter a single syllable. His remaining hand flailed frantically, battering against the neural jack behind his helmet. The hydraulic fists hammered the shell like a rabid animal trapped in a metal cage. Before he could even pry the release valve open, superheated pale green fluid began violently venting from his visor seals. A sickening pop followed. Boiling, semi-translucent brain slurry and chunky gray matter exploded across the inside of his visor, completely blacking out all display arrays. A guttural, throat-shredding shriek tore through his melted vocoder, shaking rust flakes loose from the ceiling. The hydraulic struts in his knees snapped inward. He crashed straight into the ankle-deep muck, convulsing wildly and thrashing the water. With every violent twitch, his severed hand, still pinned to the bulkhead with the needle carrying just a micro-drop of human blood, yanked against the wall, shedding showers of iron dust. I waded through the knee-high water, kicking up filthy waves that slapped against Kyle's brain-smeared visor. Bringing my knee up, I kicked the 400-pound twitching mass backward. It skidded through the sludge and slammed into the rear wall, the pinned, severed hand tearing a palm-sized chunk of rusted iron free and splashing it into the water. I grabbed the exposed hilt of my blade and ripped it loose, taking a jagged chunk of alloy gauntlet with it. The high-frequency hum numbed my palm, atomizing the leftover brain slurry on the edge into a fine mist that vanished into the steam. Daniel was slumped against the wall, shaking violently. Kyle's spiked metal hand was still clamped, shut around his throat, the human coughing up bloody foam and sewer water down his chin. I jammed my fingers into the locking seam of the gauntlet, applying enough torque to snap the alloy bolt. I yanked the deadweight hand off and tossed it into the muck, kicking up a 2-foot splash. Grabbing Daniel by the scruff of his collar, I hoisted him up like a sack of dead power cells. His legs were total jelly. He just hung off my arm, while that microscopic nick on his scalp slowly beaded crimson. His dry bag was half submerged. I snatched it up, prying open the waterproof seal with my claws. Nestled in the anti-shock foam was a heavy encryption datapad, completely intact, its cold matte metallic chassis brushing against my knuckles. I whipped out the thick metal interface cable from the back of my skull and aimed the 4-inch probe right at the unshielded physical debug port on the side of the pad. With a flick of the wrist, I rammed it home. The matte chassis instantly spiked in temperature, hot enough to brand skin. The multi-layered encryption firewalls popping up in my retinas didn't even last half a microsecond. They shattered into absolute static, like blast doors pulverized by a heavy particle cannon. No password prompts, no biometric verifications. Petabytes of raw, naked data flooded straight down the cable into my cerebral jack. It took me exactly 3 seconds to digest the entire payload. This wasn't some basic contraband ledger. It was a full-blown war protocol, stamped with the private seals of the top-tier megacorps. The bastards had purposely leaked a heavily encrypted pad containing human coordinate data, floating it on the black market to tempt every suicidal psionic hacker in the galaxy. They were baiting these idiots to jack into the chaotic, single-threaded human mimetic hazard, knowing their brains would fry instantly. Then, they'd frame the mass cerebral meltdowns as an unprovoked biological attack launched by humanity, inciting a joint interstellar armada to glass the blue planet. As a bonus, the mimetic backlash would wipe out every mid-tier syndicate competing for sector resources, even liquidating our psionic hackers guild in the crossfire, leaving the megacorps free to monopolize every mining right in the Orion Spur. Daniel leaned against the wall, coughing up tears, faint red blood oozing from the metallic choke marks on his neck. His trembling sent ripples across the puddle, washing against the base of Kyle's crippled exosuit. I glanced up at the dead merc, brain matter still seeping from his visor. Tucked into a crevice in his shoulder pauldron, His tactical comms module suddenly let out a faint, high-frequency flutter, like the buzzing of a hornet. A pale blue signal diode started strobing aggressively beneath the armor plate. The buzz violently spiked, drowning out the hiss of the steam. My fingertips were still numb from the datapad's scorching heat. I swung my severance blade down, prying the comms module and a chunk of shoulder armor off Kyle's rig and burying it into the water. But I was half a second too late. A pale blue signal pulse shot from the antenna tip. My retinal tactical feed instantly bled solid red. 2 Guild scavenger drones had already hard-locked our thermal signatures, closing in at under 800 meters. The concrete ceiling started raining dust, followed immediately by a deafening hail of armor-piercing rounds reeking of ozone. The 2-foot-thick rebar roof was shredded like wet cardboard. Shrapnel and snapped rebar whistled right past my ear, embedding into the bulkhead behind me with a shower of sparks. Chunks of debris slammed against my helmet with heavy thuds. I backhanded my high-frequency blade into a crack in the wall's rebar, using the leverage to shove Daniel dead into the blind spot of a load-bearing pillar. Massive slabs of the ceiling crashed down exactly where it'd been standing, splashing black sludge all up my legs. The screech of aero engines tore through the tunnel as AP rounds chewed up the standing water, churning it into boiling foam. The acrid tang of ozone mixed with the sewer rot stinging my lungs. I grabbed Daniel by the collar and sprinted deeper into the shaft. The stock of my plasma rifle clipped the rusted wall, chipping off a chunk of paint. The thermal warning in my neural jack was glaringly bright. The scavengers had closed the gap to 300 meters. Tracers grazed the thermal lining on my back, filling the air with the smell of scorched synthetic fibers. Daniel was coughing violently, the blood from his neck leaving a faint crimson trail in the wake of our boots. I grabbed him by the arm and hurled him onto my back. Sloshing through ankle-deep muck, I hauled ass toward the maintenance hatch leading to the hyperspace broadcast antenna array ID scanned earlier. The support pillar behind us got chewed to bits by AP rounds. Shrapnel skipped down my collar, sending a freezing shock down my spine. I kicked the rusted iron door straight off its hinges, sending it flying out into the storm. Carrying the human on my back, I weaved blindly through 3 cover zones stacked with abandoned cabling. The waste heat, bleeding off dozens of ancient servers in the array, threw off the drone's thermal optics by a good half-meter. Autocannon fire walked right up the steel framework of an idle transmission tower, drawing bright streaks of sparks across the torrential rain. I booted open the alloy door to the central hub, immediately tossing the overheating plasma rifle into the doorway to jam the seal shut. I dumped Daniel onto an old crash pad in the corner and rolled my aching shoulder. The blistering heat of the datapad still lingered on my fingertips as I sized up the completely deadlocked mainframe console in front of me. I balled up my fist and punched straight through the console's alloy casing. With a sharp crunch, shattered glass and rust sprayed across my visor, exposing the blackened, burnt-out primary power coil. I grabbed the 4-inch probe dangling from my spinal jack and rammed it in blindly. The jagged metal teeth chewed right through the motherboard's insulation. Raw electrical sparks surged up the cable, electrifying me from the nape of my neck straight down to my tailbone. Daniel was hacking up a lung in the corner, his fingers tearing right through the canvas of the old crash pad. Behind me, the plasma rifle wedged in the door, jumped and clanged as AP rounds pounded against it from the outside. Chips of paint blew through the crack and skipped across the toxic sludge pooled around my boots. With my free hand, I slammed the blisteringly hot heavy encryption datapad onto the motherboard's physical I/O port. The locking mechanism clicked shut. Sirens wailed, instantly filling the central hub. Petabytes of top-secret war protocol data surged violently up the antenna's signal feed line. The sickly, sweet stench of burning ozone permeated the air. My knuckles were still jammed into the console's cracked plastic housing when the probe in the back of my skull suddenly drove itself a half centimeter deeper into my spine. A high-explosive missile had just detonated dead center against the antenna tower's foundation. The ear-splitting, teeth-grinding groan of failing structural metal overwhelmed the room. Without warning, the entire central hub tilted violently to the left. The jammed plasma rifle slipped from the doorframe and skidded across the slanting floor, slamming into the corner. The emergency red lights ripped entirely from the ceiling, crashing into the water and throwing a shower of sparks right into Daniel's face. His death grip on the crash pad finally tore the canvas wide open, and he started sliding down the tilted deck toward the fractured doorway. I hooked my free hand onto the console's metal grab bar, my knuckles turning bone white. The data transfer progress bar jittered wildly across my retinas. The petabyte war protocol packet had hit 99%. It just needed one last physical override command to finish injecting into the hyperspace feed line. Outside the window, the rain was flashing into vapor from the drone's exhaust. The first scavenger skimmed right past the steel framework of the tower, its wings scraping off metallic shrapnel that battered against the hub's reinforced glass like hail, leaving a chaotic web of white scratch marks. The alloy floor beneath my boots was groaning, bending as the tilt angle spiked to 70 degrees. The encrypted datapad locked into the motherboard was shuddering with so much heat that its plastic edges were beginning to liquefy. Daniel finally managed to grab hold of my tactical harness at the small of my back, his fingers digging in hard enough to pinch flesh. His screaming was completely drowned out by the deafening crack of failing metal. The catastrophic snap of the main load-bearing beams sent a tremor from my boots straight to my skull. Every single anchor point decoupled simultaneously. As gravity fell away, my entire body went weightless. The zero-G kickback slammed the metal probe another half-centimeter into my spine. A sharp electric numbness shot from my tailbone to my brain, while the fingers still wedged in the cracked console strained hard enough to pop joints. Shredded plastic and glowing embers drifted right past my visor. Daniel's dead weight hanging off my harness jerked me a half-inch toward the console. I let go of the metal grab bar, reaching out to clamp my fingers around the melting edges of the encrypted datapad. That 99% progress bar was jumping like a rabid dog in my neural HUD. I brought my thumb down and crushed the physical enter key protruding from the chassis. With a sharp crack, the petabyte war protocol payload forcefully injected across every unlocked omni-band frequency. The sheer volume of the data transmission made the ozone-rich air physically vibrate. The suspended shrapnel and embers were suddenly swept upward by a concussive blast of air rolling in. The shrieking of twisting metal girders overpowered everything else. The massive, multi-story antenna tower slid clean off the 70-degree incline of the hub floor, dropping like a red-hot cleaver right through the black market's reinforced alloy dome. Outside, an aero engine screamed in critical overdrive. The second scavenger drone was banking hard to clear the falling steel frame, but it only managed to pull its nose up half an inch before thousands of tons of antenna tower slammed dead onto its fuselage. The titanium armor peeled back like wet tissue paper. The onboard antimatter payload cooked off, blossoming into a miniature, blinding white sun. The shockwave instantly vaporized the rest of the hub's observation glass, slamming a wall of scalding heat, ozone, and jet fuel straight into my face. I gritted my teeth and violently yanked my twisted fingers free from the console. A strip of flesh peeled clean off my fingertips, left stuck to the jagged plastic. The data feedback loop in my neural jack was surging in aggressive waves. The final traces of the petabyte payload had just cleared the relay stations at the edge of the galaxy. The agonizing rip of my flesh snagging on the plastic sent a spike of raw pain shooting up my arm bone and into my neck. I looked up through the gaping hole in the dome. The lone surviving scavenger drone had its armor-piercing autocannon fully spooled up, the crosshairs locked dead onto the thermal bloom of my chest. But the very next second, the drone's chassis shuddered violently. A shower of blue sparks erupted from its belly comms antenna. A maximum priority abort code from Guild High Command had just brute forced its way in, flatlining all of the drone's attack protocols. It didn't hesitate for a microsecond. Its thrusters dumped full power into a blinding blue burn, launching the drone vertically toward the stratosphere. It didn't even bother jettisoning the two high explosive missiles still on its hardpoints. Spitting 3 thermal flares in its wake, it vanished into the cloud break in seconds. The metal probe jacked into my skull, suddenly seared like a branding iron. The gold-plated top-tier hacker badge interface that had sat in my retinas for 12 years started warping, the pixels dripping down my vision like molten lead. The entire permissions architecture instantly collapsed into a blinding wall of red static. Every cross-system travel pass, every spoofed identity hash, even the escrow port for that blank triple payout contract, all of it physically slagged in a single heartbeat. Not a single byte of traceable logs remained. I tensed my shoulder muscles, violently shoving off the half-ton chunk of metallic antenna debris pinning my chest. It crashed into a pile of rubble with a massive clang, kicking up a shower of sparks. The sharp pain from my torn fingers drilled up my arm into my rear deltoid. The probe in my skull still held a wicked heat, the extra half-centimeter of depth sending pins and needles down my spine, making every hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Daniel swayed unsteadily at my hip, his legs giving out as he started sliding toward the deck. I hoisted him up by the collar. His face was caked in black soot, one lens of his glasses shattered, a streak of condensation running from his mouth. He still hadn't fully processed the relentless explosions and exploding heads. His teeth were chattering like a damn jackhammer. I crunched over steaming steel slag as we headed for the street corner. The rain beat down against my armored pauldrons, cutting through the smells of ozone, crankcase oil, and roasted metal. The junkies who had been squatting in the alley for the last half hour took one look at me and buried their faces in their knees, not daring to breathe. The checkpoint guards had long since hauled ass. Only the alien merchant's overturned glow fungus cart remained, bathing the wet pavement in an eerie green light. We hit the dive bar 3 blocks down. Its alloy blast doors had been blown 10 feet down the street by the earlier shockwave. The 3-eyed barkeep was standing behind the counter, aiming a plasma torch dead at the doorway. He took one look at my battlesuit plastered in blue alien blood, the smoking metal cable still hanging out of my neck, and dropped the torch. It clattered loudly against the grime-caked bar top. I drew the neural severance blade from my lower back and slammed it onto the bar with a heavy thud. The high-frequency edge was still coated in the black primer of Merc exoskeleton paint. The barkeep's 3 pupils dilated instantly. "Pour 2 of your meanest synth burns," I said. The barkeep fumbled like a rookie, slapping 2 chipped shot glasses onto the wood. He poured a dark crimson liquor that fizzed with sour-smelling foam, spilling half of it down the cracks of the bar. Daniel slumped onto a bar stool beside me. He reached up, his fingertips brushing that microscopic half-millimeter scratch on his scalp. His voice came out raspy, trembling. "Hell, did I just about blow y'all to kingdom come back there?" I picked up my glass. The very last smear of red, molten lead static finally faded from my retinas. 12 years of top-tier guild clearance, interstellar passes, that triple payout blank check, all totally flatlined without a trace. Right now, every comms frequency in the galaxy was broadcasting my petabyte war protocol dump on loop. Those shadow broker megacorps were probably dragging every hacker on their payroll who even looked at a human neural jack out back to be executed. I clinked my glass against Daniel's. The chemical burn of the cheap liquor made my 2 remaining functional eyes water. A distant, muffled boom rolled across the stratosphere. An orange fireball illuminated the cloud cover for a brief second. That fleeing scavenger drone, still packing 2 high-explosive missiles, had just been remotely slagged by Guild Command to cover their tracks. Not a single piece of debris even hit the ground. I downed the shot in one go. A drop of blood from my torn fingertip hit the bottom of the empty glass, blooming into a tiny red halo. No system, no identity, no triple payout payday. But there wasn't a single hacker in the entire galaxy with the balls to take a hit contract on me now. And there wasn't a single megacorp stupid enough to touch a single hair on Daniel's head. ID scrubbed every tracker clean, leaving absolutely zero digital footprints behind. I scooped up my severance blade and sheathed it. Tapping my knuckles against the bar top, I jerked my chin at the pale-faced barkeep. Pour another round. Put it on the Megacorp's tab.
Man, can we appreciate how absolutely badass that was? That heavy merc getting his brain boiled into green soup just for putting a microscopic scratch on a human's head? Hell yeah. We don't even need weapons. Our brain waves alone are a walking bioweapon that'll fry top-tier alien tech. And that hacker, dropping a petabyte war protocol and putting the bar tab on the Megacorps? Cold as ice. So I gotta ask, if a rogue alien hacker dragged you to a dive bar after blowing up a space station, what drink are you ordering? Drop it in the comments. Smash that like and subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.